July 16, 1945. The New Mexico desert, 5:29 a.m. In this moment, this precise fraction of time, humanity crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The world's first nuclear explosion illuminated the desert with the brightness of several suns. As the mushroom cloud rose into the atmosphere, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But what Oppenheimer couldn't have known in that moment was how this technology would spread across our planet. How 9 nations would eventually possess the power to end civilization, and how dozens more would flirt with this ultimate weapon. This is the story of humanity's most dangerous creation, and the extraordinary lengths countries have gone to possess it. What drove these nations to pursue such devastating power? What lines were they willing to cross? And most importantly, could your country be next? To understand how nuclear weapons spread across our world, we must first understand how they were born in the crucible of humanity's deadliest conflict. By 1939, Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe. Adolf Hitler's ambitions seemed unstoppable, and in laboratories across the Reich, German scientists were exploring the potential of nuclear fission, a discovery that could lead to weapons of unimaginable power. It was this terrifying possibility that drove physicist Leo Szilard to convince Albert Einstein to write a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, a letter that would change the course of history. The race was on. But here's what few people realize. America's pursuit of nuclear weapons was driven not just by fear of Nazi Germany, but by a profound understanding of human psychology. And so began the most expensive, secretive scientific endeavor in history, the Manhattan Project. But what was happening inside these facilities challenges everything we thought we knew about America's pursuit of nuclear power. General Leslie Groves, the military leader of the Manhattan Project, created an unprecedented system of compartmentalization. Most scientists had no idea what their colleagues in other buildings were working on. Only a handful knew the true purpose of their research. And as they raced toward completion, a moral reckoning was brewing, one that would haunt some scientists for the rest of their lives. By July 1945, the theoretical had become real. The Trinity test was scheduled. But something few documentaries ever mention is that several of the scientists placed bets on whether the nuclear chain reaction might ignite the Earth's atmosphere. That's right. Some of the greatest scientific minds believed there was a small but non-zero chance their experiment could literally end all life on Earth. And they proceeded anyway. The test was successful. America had its weapon. But Nazi Germany had already surrendered months earlier. The original justification for the bomb's development had vanished. What would they do with this terrible new power? Who would they use it against? And most importantly, what would happen once the nuclear genie was out of the bottle? The answers would shake the foundations of our world and create the most dangerous arms race in human history. August 6th and 9th, 1945. 2 Japanese cities, 2 atomic bombs, 2 instances of devastation previously unimaginable in human history. More than 200,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed. Japan surrendered days later. World War II was over. Americans celebrated in the streets, believing the atomic bomb had saved potentially millions of lives by avoiding a land invasion of Japan. But a dark new era had already begun, one where a single bomber could destroy an entire city. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin received the news with outward calm, but privately he was furious. His spies had informed him about the Manhattan Project years earlier, but he hadn't believed the Americans could succeed so quickly. What happened next reveals the extraordinary lengths countries will go to acquire nuclear weapons, and how espionage played a critical role in their spread. Stalin put his most brilliant physicist, Igor Kurchatov, in charge of the Soviet nuclear program. But he also deployed a secret weapon, an extensive network of spies who had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist who had fled Nazi Germany, passed critical nuclear secrets to Soviet intelligence. So did Theodore Hall, the youngest physicist at Los Alamos. And the Rosenbergs created a pipeline of classified information flowing directly to Moscow. The Americans believed their nuclear monopoly would last for decades. They were wrong. August 29, 1949. Just 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning. The Americans called it Joe 1 after Joseph Stalin. President Truman was shocked by how quickly the Soviets had succeeded. U.S. intelligence had predicted it would take them at least another 5 years. And just like that, the nuclear club had doubled in size. But this was only the beginning. Great Britain had been America's closest ally during the Manhattan Project. British scientists had made crucial contributions. But after the war, America abruptly ended nuclear cooperation, passing the McMahon Act of 1946, which prohibited sharing nuclear technology, even with allies. What few people realize is just how personally Winston Churchill took this betrayal, and how it drove Britain's determination to become a nuclear power regardless of cost. On October 3, 1952, Britain detonated its first nuclear device off the coast of Australia. The nuclear club now had 3 members. But as these powerful nations locked themselves in a nuclear standoff, something unexpected was happening half a world away, something that would dramatically reshape the global nuclear landscape. In France, the humiliation of Nazi occupation had been followed by another indignity: exclusion from the inner circle of nuclear powers. President Charles de Gaulle was determined to restore French grandeur and independence. On February 13, 1960, France exploded its first nuclear device in the Algerian Sahara. The nuclear club now had 4 members. But across the globe, another giant was stirring, one whose nuclear ambitions would shock the world and fundamentally alter the balance of power in Asia. Chairman Mao Zedong had unified mainland China under communist rule in 1949. Initially, the Soviet Union provided technical assistance for China's nuclear program. But what happened next reveals just how quickly nuclear alliances can fracture. By 1960, relations between China and the Soviet Union had soured dramatically. Soviet advisors were withdrawn, taking their blueprints and expertise with them. Many Western analysts believed this would cripple China's nuclear ambitions. They were wrong. On October 16, 1964, China detonated its first nuclear device. In just 15 years, the nuclear club had grown from 1 nation to 5. The speed of this proliferation terrified world leaders. If 5 countries could build nuclear weapons in less than 2 decades, how many more would follow? That question would soon be answered in ways no one expected, by nations whose nuclear programs were developed in the shadows, with methods that challenged international norms and treaties. In the aftermath of the Holocaust and surrounded by hostile neighbors who vowed to wipe it off the map, Israel faced existential threats from its first day of independence. What few people know is that Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, made a fateful decision years before the country even declared independence. But Israel faced a unique challenge. How could a small nation with limited resources develop the world's most complex weapon, all while keeping it secret? The answer came in the form of an unlikely alliance that has remained largely hidden from public view until recently. France, still smarting from the Suez Crisis where both nations had been humiliated, agreed to help Israel build a nuclear reactor at Dimona in the Negev desert. Officially, it was for peaceful purposes. But what happened next reveals the extraordinary lengths Israel went to conceal its true intentions. Israeli engineers built the Dimona facility with a secret underground level, one that never appeared on official blueprints and was hidden from international inspectors. By the late 1960s, Israel had produced enough plutonium for several nuclear weapons. But unlike every previous nuclear power, Israel made an unprecedented decision. They would never test their weapons. They would never officially acknowledge having them. This became known as Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity, or in Hebrew, amimut. This careful wording, neither confirming nor denying, allowed Israel to deter its enemies while avoiding international sanctions. During the existential crisis of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel is believed to have armed its nuclear weapons, the only time it has done so. This may have prompted the United States to rapidly airlift conventional weapons to Israel, fearing that otherwise Israel might resort to the nuclear option. Meanwhile, on the other side of Asia, another nation was contemplating the nuclear path, but for very different reasons. India had achieved independence in 1947 and positioned itself as a leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. Its first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was publicly opposed to nuclear weapons. But India's humiliating defeat in the 1962 border war with China, which had become a nuclear power just 2 years later, changed the strategic calculus. Under the leadership of physicist Homi Bhabha, India developed a dual-use nuclear program, officially peaceful, but with the capability to pivot to weapons production if needed. When Indira Gandhi became prime minister, she faced growing security threats from both nuclear-armed China and India's regional rival, Pakistan. What happened next was one of the most audacious acts of nuclear deception in history. On May 18, 1974, beneath the Rajasthan desert, India detonated a nuclear device with the explosive force of about 8 kilotons of TNT. India insisted this was a peaceful nuclear explosion for civil engineering purposes. Few nations believed this explanation. The nuclear club now had 6 members, and a new model of proliferation had emerged: the peaceful nuclear explosion. But halfway across the world, another country was secretly developing nuclear weapons through an even more clandestine program, one that remained hidden for decades. South Africa, isolated internationally due to its apartheid policies and facing what it perceived as a total onslaught from Soviet-backed forces in neighboring countries, decided it needed a nuclear deterrent. With the help of Israeli technology and by exploiting loopholes in international safeguards, South Africa built 6 nuclear weapons by the late 1980s. What has only recently come to light is the extent of nuclear cooperation between South Africa and Israel, including a suspected joint nuclear test in the South Atlantic in 1979 that was detected by an American satellite. But as apartheid began to crumble in the early 1990s, South African President F.W. de Klerk made an unprecedented decision. South Africa became the first and only nation to voluntarily relinquish its nuclear arsenal. A decision driven by the recognition that these weapons would be a dangerous inheritance for a multiracial democracy. But even as South Africa dismantled its weapons, a new and deeply concerning chapter in nuclear proliferation was unfolding, one centered around a single brilliant scientist whose actions would forever change the nuclear landscape. India's 1974 nuclear test sent shockwaves through its regional rival Pakistan. Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was determined to respond. Enter Abdul Qadir Khan, a Pakistani metallurgist working in the Netherlands at a facility connected to the European Uranium Enrichment Consortium, Urenco. What he did next would change the global nuclear landscape forever. In 1975, Khan began stealing centrifuge designs and supplier lists from his employer, some of the most closely guarded nuclear secrets in the Western world. Then he did something no one expected. He offered this treasure trove of nuclear technology to Pakistan. Bhutto immediately appointed him to lead the country's uranium enrichment program. But the most extraordinary aspect of Pakistan's nuclear program was yet to be revealed. Khan established what investigators later called a nuclear Walmart, a global black market network spanning from Germany to Malaysia, Dubai to North Korea. Companies would manufacture centrifuge parts without knowing their ultimate purpose or destination. China, seeking a strategic counterweight to India, provided Pakistan with the design for a tested nuclear weapon and enough highly enriched uranium for 2 bombs. This level of state-to-state nuclear assistance was unprecedented. On May 28, 1998, weeks after India conducted its second round of nuclear tests, Pakistan detonated 5 nuclear devices in the Chagai Hills. The nuclear club now had 7 acknowledged members. But what happened next revealed something truly alarming, something that would keep intelligence agencies awake at night for decades to come. A.Q. Khan had transformed from national hero to international nuclear dealer. His network began selling uranium enrichment technology and even weapons designs to Libya, Iran, and North Korea. The scale of this proliferation wasn't fully understood until 2003, when the interdiction of the ship BBC China exposed Libya's secret nuclear program, supplied entirely through Khan's network. In 2004, Khan appeared on Pakistani television to confess. He was immediately pardoned by Pakistan's president and placed under house arrest, but never made available for questioning by international investigators. Meanwhile, on the Korean peninsula, another nuclear crisis was unfolding, one with roots in the final days of the Cold War. North Korea, established after World War II and hardened by the Korean War, had long lived under the threat of American nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, North Korea lost its primary protector. What few people realize is that North Korea's nuclear program began as a civilian energy project with Soviet assistance in the 1950s. But by the 1980s, it had clearly pivoted toward weapons development. Throughout the 1990s, North Korea engaged in a diplomatic dance, alternately freezing and restarting its nuclear program in exchange for aid and energy assistance. On October 9, 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. The nuclear club now had 8 members. What's particularly concerning about North Korea's program is how it demonstrates that even a desperately poor country with limited resources can develop nuclear weapons if it makes them a national priority. Iran's nuclear ambitions can be traced back to the Shah, who launched the country's nuclear program in the 1950s with American help under the Atoms for Peace program. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the program was initially abandoned as un-Islamic, but was later revived as neighboring Iraq developed its own nuclear capabilities. In the 1990s, Iran received centrifuge designs and components from the AQ-Khan network. By the early 2000s, evidence of a covert uranium enrichment program had emerged. What followed was one of the most complex diplomatic negotiations in history, culminating in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an agreement designed to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons while permitting civilian nuclear activities. But the nuclear saga didn't end there. The agreement's subsequent unraveling and Iran's continued advancement of its nuclear capabilities has left the world in a precarious position. And this brings us to perhaps the most troubling question of all. In a world where nuclear technology continues to spread, which country will be next? Today, more than 30 countries possess the technical capability to build nuclear weapons. What stops them isn't technical barriers, it's political choice. Japan, Germany, South Korea, Canada, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, and many others could develop nuclear weapons within months or years if they decided to. But they've chosen a different path. The 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty created a grand bargain. Countries without nuclear weapons promised not to acquire them, while the 5 recognized nuclear powers pledged to work toward disarmament. In exchange, all nations would have access to peaceful nuclear technology. The International Atomic Energy Agency serves as the world's nuclear watchdog, conducting inspections and monitoring compliance. But its powers are limited, and nations determined to deceive can often stay one step ahead. And now, new technologies are making proliferation even more difficult to control. Advanced centrifuges can enrich uranium in smaller facilities with less detectable signatures. 3D printing could potentially manufacture specialized components that were once difficult to acquire. And cyber capabilities can both aid proliferation and potentially disrupt it, as we saw with the Stuxnet virus that temporarily set back Iran's program. But perhaps the most frightening nuclear scenario isn't the emergence of a new nuclear state. It's the possibility that nuclear weapons, materials, or expertise could fall into the hands of non-state actors. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, securing Russia's vast nuclear arsenal became an urgent international priority. The Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program spent billions to ensure that nuclear weapons didn't go missing during the chaotic transition. Since the 1990s, there have been dozens of confirmed incidents of nuclear material trafficking. Most involve small quantities unsuitable for weapons, but the pattern is deeply concerning. In response, world leaders have held regular nuclear security summits to coordinate efforts to secure vulnerable nuclear materials. But gaps remain. Meanwhile, the world's 9 nuclear powers still possess approximately 13,000 nuclear warheads. The United States and Russia maintain roughly 90% of this total. Even a limited nuclear exchange would cause catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences. A full-scale nuclear war between major powers could potentially end civilization as we know it. Yet despite these existential risks, nuclear disarmament has stalled. The architecture of arms control built during the Cold War has been crumbling, with key treaties abandoned or expired. and history is littered with nuclear near misses, moments when the world came perilously close to nuclear war through miscalculation, technical malfunction, or human error. In 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov was on duty when his early warning systems indicated 5 American nuclear missiles were heading toward the Soviet Union. Following protocol would have triggered a retaliatory strike. Instead, Petrov made a gut decision that the warning was a false alarm. And he was right. A single person's judgment may have prevented nuclear war. Today's command and control systems are more sophisticated, but the fundamental human elements and potential for error remain. And now a new factor is entering the nuclear equation: climate change. As resource scarcity and environmental stresses increase global tensions, nuclear deterrence becomes an even more precarious foundation for international security. Yet there are also signs of hope. Grassroots movements have helped stigmatize nuclear weapons and push for disarmament. The 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, though rejected by all nuclear powers, represents an effort to establish an international norm against nuclear weapons. And quiet, patient diplomacy continues to manage nuclear risks and prevent further proliferation. The story of how countries got nuclear weapons is, at its heart, a story about human fear, ambition, and the quest for security in an uncertain world. From the desert of New Mexico to the mountains of North Korea, humanity has lived for over 75 years with the power to destroy itself. 9 nations have crossed the nuclear threshold, and others have approached it before turning back. The choices these countries made, and the choices we make today, will shape the nuclear future. Will we continue to rely on deterrence? Will disarmament ever be possible? Or are we destined to live indefinitely with the possibility of annihilation? What's certain is that as long as even one nuclear weapon exists, its awesome destructive power remains a sword hanging over humanity's future. And perhaps the most important question isn't how countries got nuclear weapons, but whether we can summon the wisdom to ensure they're never used again. Because the future of our world may depend on it.